It was a cold, unforgiving January night, the kind that seemed to press the warmth out of the entire city. I was 23 and working a grueling overnight shift in data entry for a firm downtown. Every Friday, I would catch the very last commuter train home. It wasn't just late. It was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost train. Most of the time, I had the entire carriage, sometimes the entire train, to myself. I didn't realize it then, but isolation is a vacuum, and sometimes the universe decides to fill that vacuum with something utterly malignant. The station, deep beneath the city, was a cavern of stale air, an echoing silence. The smell of old oil and disinfectant was overpowering. When the train finally arrived around 1:45 a.m., it was a sudden, roaring intrusion into the quiet. I walked toward the second-to-last car. It was my routine. Sit on the right side, second row from the door, a position that gave me a clear view of the length of the carriage and the safety cord overhead. Tonight, however, I wasn't alone. The train had barely 10 people on it, scattered like pieces of a broken puzzle. But there was one figure that immediately caught my attention, a man I'd never seen before, sitting in the very last car. He wasn't doing anything overtly strange, he was just sitting there, perfectly still. That was the first point of curiosity that settled into my chest. Everyone on a late-night train is usually engrossed in their phone, asleep, or staring blankly at the dark window. But this man wasn't. He was staring directly down the length of the train, toward the doors separating his car from mine. A static, unblinking gaze that seemed to pass right through the steel and glass. I settled into my seat, pulled out my battered laptop, and tried to focus on an old movie, but my attention kept drifting. The psychological landscape of an empty late-night train is unique. Every squeak of the suspension, every minor adjustment of the brakes, becomes amplified. You are a collection of soft tissues and blood, hurtling through the dark, surrounded by nothing but glass and metal, utterly vulnerable. After about 20 minutes of rumbling through the empty suburbs, the man finally moved. It was a slow, almost mechanical motion. He reached up, took off a dark, woolen cap, and placed it neatly beside him. Underneath, his head was completely shaven, glistening faintly in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Then he stood up. This was the point where the uncertainty began. When someone stands up on an empty train, they are usually heading for the exit, or perhaps the restroom. But he didn't move toward the doors. Instead, he walked slowly toward the large window beside his seat and pressed his palm flat against the glass, holding it there for a long time. It was an act of profound, unsettling weirdness. The kind of thing that makes you want to look away, but you can't, because you need to understand the anomaly. I watched, frozen, as he began to slowly, deliberately trace a pattern on the condensation. Not a quick doodle, but deep, looping lines, like an old compass drawing. He was moving his hand with the meticulous focus of someone attempting to forge a signature. My internal monologue, the voice of the skeptic, was screaming. He's just some eccentric guy. Maybe he has OCD. Maybe he's drunk. Just watch your movie. But the primal part of my brain, the one that deals with shadows and isolation, was telling me, this isn't right. Get out of here. Hell, the train was due to stop at the next station in 5 minutes. I decided I couldn't sit there and wait. I rationalized it as needing a different view from my movie, a completely ludicrous excuse. I packed up my laptop, stood, and walked through the door to the car ahead of me, the one right behind the driver's cab. I felt a small spike of adrenaline. I was now much closer to the only other human presence. I sat down, my heart thumping a quick, erratic rhythm. I didn't look back immediately. I focused on my breathing, trying to regain the calm that the isolation had stripped away. A moment later, the door between the cars hissed open. My body went cold. I looked up. It was him. The shaven-headed man had followed me. He walked into the car, his movement still slow and deliberate, and he didn't look at me. He walked past my row, past the next, and sat down in the very last seat of this car, the one that put him directly opposite the connection to the empty car he just vacated. He hadn't followed me to bother me. He had followed me to maintain a distance. He wanted the last seat in the second-to-last car, just as he'd wanted the last seat in the very last car. It felt less like a chance encounter, and more like a carefully executed shift on a chessboard. The persistent fear was starting to settle in. It wasn't that he was stalking me, it was that he was using the train in a way that felt wrong, and I was simply an obstacle he had to navigate around. The train rattled on, the dark outside rushing by in a blur of black trees and streetlights. I tried to go back to my movie, but every nerve ending was screaming. I kept glancing at his reflection in the window glass. He was back to his original position, perfectly still, staring out into the absolute blackness, his eyes catching the light with a flat, dull intensity. Suddenly, the grinding screech of the brakes filled the car. Much too loud, much too abrupt. The train jerked violently, throwing me against the armrest, and then it stopped completely. Everything went quiet. The only sound was the distant, faint humming of the train's machinery. We were stalled, completely immobilized, between stations. A beat passed, then another. The lights flickered but held steady. My stomach dropped. We were trapped. I waited for the announcement, a delay, a mechanical issue, anything. Nothing came. Not even the driver's muffled voice. I looked back at the shaven-headed man. He was still staring out the window, but now his gaze seemed to be fixed on something specific in the impenetrable dark. Then he stood up again. This time, his movement was different. There was an efficiency to it, a terrible sense of purpose. He didn't walk to the window. He walked straight down the aisle, past my seat, heading not toward the driver's cab, but to the door that connected my car to the one ahead. As he reached the door, he turned his head slowly, just enough that his profile was visible. The fluorescent light of the car caught his cheekbone and the side of his mouth. He wasn't staring out the window to look at the scenery. He was staring into the dark to keep an eye on his reflection, and in that moment, as his eyes met mine across the dark glass of the train door, I saw not a reflection, but a chilling detail. A faint, white residue of a surgical mask outline still clinging to the skin around his nose and mouth, as if he had just, very recently, peeled it off. Then, the train lights died. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The darkness that followed was total. It wasn't the kind of darkness you get when you turn off a lamp. It was a physical absence of light, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press down on my chest, muffling the already quiet hum of the machinery. The silence immediately felt weaponized. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, frantic drum. The sight of the surgical mask residue, the implication of calculation and preparation had been the final piece of the puzzle. The train hadn't stopped due to a mechanical error. It had stopped because he had engineered the stop, and he hadn't moved to the front car to talk to the driver. He had moved to position himself closer to the emergency override, or perhaps to simply be out of sight when the lights went down. This was the start of the panic. I fumbled for my phone. The small, sickly blue-white light was a meager shield against the black. I scanned the car, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. He was gone. The door connecting the cars was a dark void, unmoving. My legs were shaking, but the survival instinct, cold and clear, finally took over. I couldn't stay here. My initial move forward had been a mistake. My only chance was to put distance between us and try to get to a phone signal, or to somehow communicate with the outside world. I had to move backward, into the last car, the one that felt the most isolated. Logically, it was the worst decision, but it felt like the only path that didn't involve walking directly toward the unknown threat. I moved with exaggerated care, one foot in front of the other, listening to the crunch of my own shoes on the train floor. My phone light bounced erratically, making the empty seats look like crouching figures. When I reached the door connecting my car to the last one, I hesitated. What if he hadn't gone forward at all? What if he was simply waiting for me to make a noise? I pushed the door open, the hiss of the pneumatic mechanism sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The last car was a duplicate of mine, but the darkness here was deeper, more oppressive. I took 3 tentative steps in, my eyes straining. The beam of my phone swept across the seats. Empty. My breath hitched in relief. He wasn't here. I moved quickly toward the far end of the car, the tail of the train, where the rear window offered an escape route. If only I could break the glass and climb out, a desperate, foolish thought. As I reached the final row, I heard it. A small, almost imperceptible sound coming from the car I had just left. Click. It was the sound of the pneumatic door closing, but not the door between the cars. It sounded like the external side door, the main passenger door, on the car I had just fled. He hadn't stopped the train to get to me. He had stopped it to get out. The sudden realization was a horrifying twist. The fear instantly transformed from a terror of confrontation to a terror of the unknown. Was he off the train, standing somewhere in the blackness beside the tracks? And why? The click was immediately followed by a slow, rhythmic, metallic tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, but in the silence, it was as distinct as a metronome. It was coming from outside the train, just on the other side of the glass. The sound was moving. It was walking along the length of the train, toward me, the last car. I scrambled back. There was no time to think, no time to reason. I dove between the seats in the last row, pushing my laptop bag under the cushion and flattening myself against the grime-covered floor. I pressed my back against the cold, vibrating metal wall. The tapping got louder. Tap, tap, tap. Now, it was directly outside my window, right where the glass meets the metal frame. I could see absolutely nothing. It was like a blind man's cane exploring the side of my prison. My mind raced. He's outside. He's walking the length of the car. He knows I'm in the last one. Why isn't he climbing back in? A faint light appeared, illuminating the window beside my head. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It was a soft, diffuse glow, like a phone screen. The light was held flat against the glass, moving slowly, up and down, as if someone was scrolling through a long document. Then, the slow, deliberate scrolling stopped. The light settled. Directly outside, silhouetted in the dim glow of his own screen, was the man's face, pressed right against the glass. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't glaring. His expression was utterly neutral, distant, and focused. His eyes were wide open. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, into the darkness of the empty train car, almost as if he was counting the empty seats. It felt less like a predatory stare, and more like a deeply unsettling quality control check. He stayed there for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably only 40 seconds. The tapping stopped. The silence returned, filled only by my ragged, held breath. The light on the glass shifted, then vanished. I heard the distinct, muffled clunk of a heavy shoe landing on the ballast stones outside, followed by the sound of his footsteps retreating. He was walking away from the train, back toward the city, blending into the surrounding night. I didn't move for another 5 minutes, paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated weirdness of the encounter. He hadn't tried to break in. He hadn't even acknowledged my presence. He had simply stopped the train, walked its length while staring in, and then walked away. Finally, tentatively, I crawled out from under the seats. I reached the end of the train and yanked open the emergency door, stepping onto the small platform area between the last car and the absolute end. I pulled down the emergency communication cord, putting my full weight into it. A loud, piercing alarm immediately began to wail, first within the train, then echoing outside. Almost instantly, the lights in the entire train flickered back on, bathing the car in a harsh, sudden yellow glare. The power had been restored. Moments later, the train lurched, then began to move, slowly at first, then accelerating rapidly. The driver, a calm thinker named Mark I knew from previous nights, came over the intercom, his voice crackling with annoyance. To the passenger who pulled the emergency brake, "We were stalled due to an external power glitch. Everything is fine. Do not interfere with the system. We are back on schedule." I stood there, leaning against the cold metal, my body shaking uncontrollably. A power glitch? The surgical mask residue? The side door opening? The man tapping on the window? The train pulled into my station, the final stop, 10 minutes later. The platform was deserted. I was the only one who got off. I walked out to the parking lot, my reflection now, a disheveled figure, eyes wide with residual terror. It was only then, as I reached for my car keys, that I realized I had left my laptop bag on the floor where I had been hiding. I walked back to the platform entrance, preparing to rush back and grab it. But the train was already gone, heading to the yard. I slumped against the wall, utterly defeated. My laptop was gone. All my data, all my personal files, lost to the ghost train. I had no choice but to call the transport authority. I gave them the basic details. I lost a bag on the train. I couldn't bring myself to mention the man, the darkness, or the tapping. I knew how it would sound. The ravings of a tired night worker. They called me the next morning. My bag had been found. It was in the very last seat of the very last car, right where I had left it. Everything was inside, except for my laptop. Instead of my laptop, tucked neatly into the sleeve, was a small, silver-plated object. It was a small house key, attached to a tag with a single, handwritten, chilling detail. A 4-digit street address that belonged to a side street in my own neighborhood. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't stolen my laptop. He had taken it, opened it, found my address, and left me a terrifying souvenir that proved just how close he had been. He hadn't been an obstacle to me. I had been a momentary delay to him, and his purpose was not to hurt me physically, but to leave me with the persistent fear, the haunting, cold knowledge that I had been watched, targeted, and that someone out there, silent and methodical, still had the key to a door I knew nothing about. In the neighborhood I called home. The case was never closed. I moved apartments 3 weeks later. The key is in a small, locked box in my safe. A cold, sharp reminder that the darkest places on Earth are not empty. They are simply waiting to be filled by the calculating malice of real people. Every time I hear a train horn late at night, I feel the familiar coldness of the polished metal, and I wonder what door that key opens, and whether the man on the Midnight Express is simply waiting for the next power glitch to walk the rails again. The train was pure isolation. The bus, by contrast, was an enforced, suffocating intimacy. For 3 years, my life was dictated by the 5:30 p.m. run of the Route 12 city bus. It was the evening commute from the financial district to my suburb, and it was always the same, overcrowded, smelling faintly of cheap cologne, wet umbrellas, and existential dread. We were all sardines in a metal can, united only by our desire to escape the day. My routine was rigid. I'd stand near the rear emergency exit, holding the cold metal pole. From that vantage point, I could see the whole car. There was Miss Henderson, the overreactor, who wore a new pair of designer sunglasses every day. There was Robert, the skeptic, a financial analyst who spent the entire ride with headphones in, pointedly ignoring everyone. And then, there was the man who came to occupy the deep, dark well of my curiosity. He was always there, in the absolute back corner of the bus, tucked into the bench seat that curved around the back window. He looked to be in his mid-40s, wearing the same faded, gray raincoat regardless of the weather. His hair was messy, and he kept his head down, but I could often catch his face in the periphery of my vision. He didn't sleep. He merely vibrated with a low, constant intensity, like a machine running too hot. I started calling him the Screaming Man in my head. He never actually screamed, but his face always looked seconds away from it. His jaw was perpetually clenched, the muscles working under his skin as if fighting off some unspeakable pressure. For months, he was just background noise, another casualty of the daily grind. Until one Thursday evening in late spring, when the routine finally shattered. We were crossing the old steel bridge over the industrial shipping canal, a long, rusty stretch of road where the engine always seemed to strain. It was a loud, grating segment of the route. I was leaning against the pole, checking my email when it happened. It was a sound that didn't belong to a civilized world. A raw, unadulterated wail of sheer terror. A sound that cut through the engine noise, the chatter, and Robert's loud pop music. It was a single, long, sustained note of agony. Not a word or a yell, but a sound ripped from the very core of a suffering soul. The bus immediately became a scene of chaotic fear. Miss Henderson let out a sharp cry and fumbled with her purse. Robert's headphones flew off as he instinctively recoiled. The driver, a large, calm thinker named Carl, who had been driving this route for 20 years, slammed on the brakes. The bus skidded slightly, metallic screeching on the bridge deck, and came to an abrupt, jolting stop. "What in the hell was that?" Carl's voice boomed over the internal speaker, surprisingly level. Everyone on the bus was looking toward the back. The scream had come from the back. The Screaming Man was gone. The entire backbench seat was empty. The window was fogged with condensation, but there was no person. The back door, the emergency exit beside my position, was still closed. Robert, the skeptic, was the first to speak. He looked genuinely shaken, his face pale. Did someone fall? Did someone jump off the bridge? A couple near the middle were already dialing 911. Carl, bless his unflappable soul, put the bus in park and began slowly walking down the aisle. "Where did he go?" a woman whispered. Carl reached the back, looked around, and shook his head. "I see nothing. Nobody is back here. Y'all stay put. I'm getting out to check the door seals." He was back in his seat within 60 seconds. He didn't check the bridge railing. He didn't call the police. He just sat back down, put the bus in drive, and we rumbled on. As we cleared the bridge, the tension on the bus began to dissolve, but the sheer volume of the noise did not. I leaned over to Robert, who was collecting his thoughts, trying to recapture his cynicism. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice still tight. "That scream. That was him. The guy in the back. He must have somehow gotten out." Robert looked at me with an expression of complete, unadulterated confusion. "Scream? What are you talking about? Are you okay?" "The scream, just now. The one that made Carl slam the brakes. The guy in the back. The one in the rain jacket." Robert frowned. He slowly put his headphones back on, but didn't press play. He kept staring at me. "Look, I heard the bus brake hard," he said, his tone low and utterly dismissive. "It was a close call. Maybe a car cut us off. There was no scream, pal. You must have zoned out and dreamt it." Uncertainty hit me like a physical punch. I looked around the bus. "Miss?" Henderson was back to texting, the light glinting off her new sunglasses. The couple who had been dialing 911 were now calmly discussing dinner plans. Every single person on that bus, except for me, had reverted to their original commuting postures, as if the last 5 minutes had been scrubbed from reality. I felt a cold, prickling sensation crawl up my neck. I looked back at the empty seat. The condensation was still there, but the man was gone. My internal voice, the voice of the rational mind, screamed, "Gaslighting. You are being gaslit by an entire bus of people, or you are having a breakdown." But the persistent fear was a colder reality. I had heard it. It was real. And everyone else was pretending it wasn't. The bus eventually pulled up to my stop. I stumbled off, my legs weak, and spent the entire walk home replaying the scream, testing the memory against the possibility of a shared delusion. The next day, Friday, I got on the Route 12 bus at 5:30 p.m. I looked for the screaming man. He wasn't there. The bus was the usual scene of muted collective misery. I felt a wave of relief. It was a one-off, a random piece of bizarre theater. But then, as we approached the steel bridge over the shipping canal, I saw it. He was back. The screaming man, in the faded gray raincoat, was sitting in the back corner, head down, vibrating with that unbearable internal pressure. It was like he had been rebooted, returned to his default setting, ready for the next run. I felt a fresh wave of panic, hot and acrid, in my throat. I couldn't get off. I was 10 minutes from my stop. I gripped the pole, bracing myself, my gaze fixed on the back of the bus. We hit the steel grating of the bridge. The bus started its usual metallic clamor. I held my breath. And then, precisely at the midpoint of the bridge, it came again. The sound was identical. The same pitch, the same duration, the same raw quality of pure, desperate anguish. Carl, the driver, slammed the brakes. The bus skidded and stopped, exactly in the same place as yesterday. The bus exploded into chaos. Miss Henderson shrieked. Robert ripped his headphones out. Everyone looked to the back. The screaming man was gone. The back bench was empty. Carl, just as calmly as before, put the bus in park. I looked at Robert, whose eyes were wide and terrified. This time, I had a witness. "You heard that, right?" I demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the empty seat. "The scream. The man. It happened again." Robert stared at the back seat for a long moment, then slowly turned his head to look at me. His face was a mask of exasperated concern. "Dude, the brakes. I told you, he slammed on the brakes again. We almost had a pileup. Look out the window, he's probably yelling at a car." He gestured toward the front of the bus. I looked forward. Carl was still sitting in his seat, completely unmoving. "What?" "No, that was a scream. A person screaming." I could hear the hysteria in my own voice. "I didn't hear anything but the tires," Robert insisted, his voice hardening, his skepticism returning with chilling speed. He pulled out his phone and started composing a text message, pointedly ignoring me. He had reset again. I looked around. Miss Henderson was checking her hair and her sunglasses. The couple was talking about something mundane. The collective amnesia was total. But this time, I noticed a detail I had missed the day before. The back window, where the screaming man had been sitting, didn't just have condensation. In the upper right corner, where he would have rested his head, a small, dark, finger-sized smudge of liquid was slowly running down the glass. And I knew, with terrible certainty, that this wasn't a trick of the light, or a shared delusion. It was a routine, and I was the only audience. The uncertainty had curdled into a cold, paralyzing dread. I had witnessed the same horrifying incident 2 days in a row, and 2 days in a row, the entire bus had denied its existence. I was trapped in a nightmare where I was the only reliable observer. The psychological horror was the fear not of the screaming man himself, but of my own sanity. Why was I the only one who heard him? Why did everyone else immediately and collectively erase the event? The memory of the dark smudge on the glass was the only thing anchoring me to reality. Blood? Grime? I didn't know, but it was physical evidence where everyone else offered only denial. I spent all of Saturday consumed by a desperate, obsessive need for information. I couldn't call the police. I couldn't tell my friends. A ghost on the bus screams once a day, but only I can hear it. I would be institutionalized. Instead, I focused on the man. I went to the city archives and sifted through public records, searching for anything about a bus incident on the steel bridge. Nothing. I searched local news outlets, looking for missing persons matching his description. Nothing. It was a complete blank. He was a phantom who existed only during the 5:30 p.m. Route 12 commute. By Monday, the fear had transformed into a desperate, reckless curiosity. I had to know. I had to break the routine. I got on the bus, and he was there, back corner, raincoat, head down, the unbearable tension radiating from him. I didn't sit in my usual spot by the rear door. I sat closer to the middle, one seat behind Robert, the skeptic, who was already plugged into his music. As we neared the steel bridge, my adrenaline surged. I was ready to jump up, to yell, to force a confrontation. We hit the bridge. The usual metallic racket began. But this time, I didn't wait. As the bus began its heavy labor across the worn steel, I moved. I grabbed my bag and walked quickly, purposefully, to the back of the bus. I stood over the screaming man, my heart hammering so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. He was still staring at the floor. "Sir," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to be heard over the engine. "Sir, I need to talk to you." He didn't move. I waited another beat, then reached out and gently touched his shoulder. "Hey, look at me. What is happening?" He finally moved. It was a slow, agonizing lift of the head. His face was exactly as I remembered. Pale, jaw clenched, eyes wide, filled with a deep, silent terror. And then, just as he was about to speak, just as his lips parted, the bus driver, Carl, spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are having a slight delay. Everything is fine. Just a moment." Carl hadn't slammed the brakes. The bus was still moving. But the sound of pure, sustained terror began. It was a wall of sound, so loud it felt physical, like a hammer striking my eardrums. I recoiled, hands flying up to cover my ears. My vision tunneled. I looked back at the screaming man. He was still sitting there, head lifted, jaw clenched, silent. The scream was coming from him, but his mouth wasn't moving. It was an echo, a psychic residue. The sound of a scream I had heard 2 days in a row, playing at the exact same time, in the exact same location, from a person who was physically silent. The real, mind-breaking twist was that the scream was not an event, it was a location-based phenomenon. It was tied to the midpoint of the steel bridge and the presence of the screaming man. I dropped my hands, shaking my head violently, trying to clear the noise. The sound was still going, tearing at my concentration. I looked forward. Robert was texting, headphones in, a small, impatient sigh escaping him as Carl's voice came back over the intercom. "Apologies, folks. We're moving now." Minor engine hiccup. The scream, as suddenly as it began, cut off. Complete silence. I stared at the man. His eyes were now locked on mine. He wasn't scared of me. He was scared of what I had just heard. He slowly, agonizingly, raised a finger to his lips, a gesture of profound, desperate silence. Then he leaned forward, close to my ear, and whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "It wasn't me, you hear. It was him." "Who?" I whispered back, completely unnerved. Who was it? His eyes darted up, quickly, toward the back window, and then back to me. His expression was one of profound, guilt-ridden reflection. The driver, Carl, he never got off the bus. He just had to get off this route. And then, before I could ask what he meant, the bus pulled to an abrupt stop. Not at my stop, but somewhere in the middle of a quiet, unfamiliar residential block. The driver, Carl, stood up from his seat. He walked into the aisle, his usual calm thinker demeanor now replaced by an unnerving stillness. He looked straight back at the two of us. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Carl said, his voice flat and motionless. "We have reached the end of the line. Everyone off." "Everyone on the bus, miss." Henderson, Robert, the couple, they all stood up without a word, collected their bags, and began filing off the bus as if this unscheduled stop was the most normal thing in the world. They were like programmed, oblivious mannequins. I looked at the screaming man. He was already getting up, his head down, moving with the crowd. "Wait, what about Carl? What did he do?" I hissed at him, grabbing his arm. He pulled away, his eyes wide with panic. "Leave. Just leave. Before he realizes you heard it all 3 times. I didn't need to be told twice. I plunged into the crowd, tumbling out onto the street. The air was cool and smelled of cut grass, a stark contrast to the metallic smell of the bus. I turned back to look at the bus, now completely empty. The screaming man and Carl were the only two left. Carl was standing in the aisle, calmly watching the rear door. The bus lights flickered, then went out, plunging the interior into a sudden, deep dark. I stood there, surrounded by the suburban stillness, my hands shaking. I had been given a clue, a piece of a truly terrifying puzzle. Carl, the driver, had done something on the bridge. And the screaming man was the daily echo of his guilt, the sound of the victim's last moments, forced to play on loop every day. I never rode the Route 12 bus again. But a few weeks later, my persistent fear drove me to do one last, desperate search. I broadened my criteria. Not missing persons, but unsolved disappearances near the steel bridge. I found it. A small article, almost 20 years old. A young woman, an English teacher, had disappeared on a stormy night. Her car was found abandoned on the side of the steel bridge. The last person who had seen her was a bus driver who had stopped to ask if she needed help. The driver's name was Carl Stevens. The article mentioned he was the primary suspect but was never charged due to lack of evidence. The last photograph they showed of her was haunting. She had been wearing a light gray raincoat. The screaming man wasn't echoing his own scream. He was echoing hers. He wasn't a victim. He was a haunted witness, forced to ride the route of his trauma every day, reliving the moment of her panic, the moment she was dragged off the bus, or perhaps even off the bridge at the exact same point, for the benefit of the universe, and for the ears of anyone unlucky enough to truly listen. The subway is a different breed of beast. It's not the isolation of the commuter train, or the suffocating familiarity of the bus. The subway is a transient, electric tomb, a vast network of concrete and steel, where you are constantly surrounded by strangers who, through collective agreement, pretend you don't exist. My story takes place on the Red Line, late on a humid August night. I was 26 and had just had a terrible, final argument with my partner, Sarah. I'd walked out of our apartment in a blind rage, needing to clear my head, and found myself aimlessly riding the train out to the final end of the line stop, a station called Rivergate. Rivergate was famous for being a ghost town. It was built during a housing boom that collapsed, leaving a massive, gleaming terminal that served almost no one. It was the type of place that made you feel like you were not just leaving the city, but leaving the modern world entirely. When I reached the station around 1 a.m., the isolation was immediate and profound. The air was heavy, smelling of ozone and stagnant water. I was the only person who stepped off the train. The doors hissed shut behind me, and the train immediately rumbled back into the tunnel, leaving me on a platform that stretched out like an unused runway, lit by harsh, buzzing sodium lamps. I needed a moment of reflection, to think about Sarah and my life. I sat on a bench, put my head in my hands, and tried to sort through the emotional wreckage. After about 5 minutes, the sound of my own breathing and the frantic clicking of some unseen insects was all I could hear. The thought of waiting 20 minutes for the next train back felt unbearable. I decided to walk upstairs to the main entrance, grab a bottle of water, and try to calm down. I took the long, fluorescent-lit escalator up to the street-level terminal. The entire floor was polished granite, and the echoes of my footsteps were unsettlingly loud. The token booth was shuttered. The kiosks were all padlocked. The whole place was designed to handle thousands, but it was occupied by only one. Me. I walked toward the only vending machine I could see, tucked away in an alcove near the public restrooms. As I approached, I heard a noise, a sound that cut through the silence like a sharp knife. It was a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like metal being dragged across stone. It was coming from the hallway that led to the restrooms. Curiosity mixed with the rising tide of adrenaline. This wasn't a rat or a maintenance worker. This was a slow, heavy drag. I stopped near the vending machine, frozen. The fluorescent light hummed loudly, trying to assert a sense of normalcy that the dragging sound immediately refuted. The sound stopped. Silence. I waited, my hand clutching a $5 bill uselessly. I was the only one in the entire terminal, except for whoever, or whatever, was making that sound. I should have run. I should have turned around and sprinted back down the escalator to the platform. But the skeptic in me, the one trying to fight off the panic of the earlier argument, told me it was just a homeless person moving a cart. I took one small, cautious step toward the hallway entrance. The sound started again. Scra. One long, continuous drag. And then, it stopped just at the edge of the alcove. A black shape appeared in my peripheral vision. It was a shoe. A heavy, worn work boot. It was resting on the polished floor, pointing directly at me. Then, the foot shifted. The heel scraped against the granite. A man, slowly, with excruciating slowness, dragged himself into view. He was tall, heavily built, and wearing dark, stained work clothes. He wasn't standing. He was sitting, or perhaps half reclining, dragging himself forward using his hands. One of his legs appeared to be completely useless, trailing behind him. But it wasn't the broken leg that froze my blood. It was his head. He wasn't dragging his body. He was dragging something else. He was wearing a massive, dark hood, pulled far forward, and he was holding something against his chest, cradled like a sick child. It was large and bulky, completely covered by the folds of his coat. But as he moved, the dark, stained fabric shifted, and for a split second, I saw a flash of pale, almost white material beneath the hood's edge, a shape that was too smooth, too round, to be a pillow or a bundle of clothes. It was a mannequin's head, or rather, something that looked like a mannequin's head, bald, featureless, and disturbingly white. He stopped, sitting directly in the middle of the hallway entrance. His back was to the vending machine, blocking my only chance for a drink. He didn't look up. He just sat there, breathing heavily, the sound of his ragged inhalations echoing in the empty hall. I felt the first hot flush of fear. This was not a homeless man. This was a man with a broken body, a disturbing prop, and a terrifying, deliberate stillness. This was the point where the fear of the unknown turns into the fear of being seen. I knew I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. Any movement would acknowledge his presence and invite a confrontation I felt completely unprepared for. He then performed a small, unnerving action. He shifted the head in his lap, adjusting the heavy coat around it, almost tenderly. And then, a sound came from beneath the hood. It was a faint, almost childlike giggle, high-pitched and utterly out of place. It was the sound of something deeply, irrevocably wrong. I finally understood the situation. This was the unexpected twist. The man was using the abandoned terminal, the last stop, for something private and horrific. And I, the man fleeing a domestic dispute, had stumbled directly into his solitary ritual. My panic finally overtook my rationality. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were glued to the polished granite. I watched, mouth dry, as the man slowly, painfully, began to drag himself again. Not toward me, but past the vending machine, deeper into the dark, unlit corridor that led to the maintenance rooms. He was moving with the agonizing slowness of a wounded animal, and yet, there was a terrible, practiced rhythm to his movements. As he reached the corner of the corridor, his back now fully to me, He spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly whisper that nonetheless carried clearly in the stillness of the terminal. "Don't let the next one see you," he rasped. And then, with one final, wet-sounding scrape, he was gone, absorbed by the darkness of the service corridor. My mind reeled. The next one? What did that mean? Was he warning me, or was he the one who had just warned the next threat? I didn't wait to find out. I turned, adrenaline flooding my system, and sprinted toward the main entrance. I had to get outside, get to a cab, get to any place that had other people. I reached the massive, glass revolving door. I pushed it hard, and it spun, carrying me out into the humid, deserted street. I stood on the street, gasping for air, leaning against the cold, metal frame of a newspaper dispenser. The air outside was thick and heavy, but the openness felt like salvation. The only thing I could see was a long, dark stretch of road leading into the residential suburbs, completely empty, and the massive, windowless concrete shell of the Rivergate terminal behind me. My immediate survival instinct was to call the police, but the reflection that followed stopped me cold. What would I tell them? A man with a broken leg dragged a hooded, giggling doll's head into a service hallway at the end of the subway line. They would send a patrol car, find nothing, and I would be flagged as a prank caller or someone experiencing an acute psychotic episode. I knew I couldn't stay on the street, either. It was too quiet, too remote. I needed to get back to the city. I looked at my phone. The next train was in 18 minutes. I had to go back into the station. I walked through the emergency exit door, a heavy, slamming piece of metal, and found myself back on the upper level. It was exactly as I had left it. Empty. Silent. The silence, however, was now different. It wasn't a peaceful, quiet. It was a holding pattern. I walked briskly toward the escalator, descending back toward the platform. As I reached the bottom step, I saw it. It was a small, almost insignificant detail that brought the whole terrifying encounter back into sharp focus. On the pristine, dust-free floor of the platform, running parallel to the edge, were two faint but distinct parallel drag marks. They were not the scuff marks of a shoe. They were the indentations of something heavy being pulled, and they didn't lead toward the service tunnels. They led directly to the center of the platform, the area where people usually stand to wait for the train. I followed them with my eyes, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The marks stopped abruptly at the platform edge. Then they picked up again, a few feet down the track. The man hadn't been dragging himself out of the station. He had been moving himself and his bundle along the length of the platform. I scanned the track, using my phone's flashlight. The track was dark, the third rail glinting menacingly. Nothing. My persistent fear was now cemented. The man's purpose was tied to the train. He was waiting for it, or he was waiting for me to wait for it. I settled onto a bench far down the platform, away from the drag marks, my whole body coiled, ready to spring. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, the screen glowing like a lifeline. The 18 minutes felt like an eternity. Every distant, high-pitched screech of metal in the tunnel made me jump. Finally, a deep, rhythmic vibration started in the track beneath my feet. A roar began to build in the tunnel. The train was coming. I stood up, ready to board. As the headlight of the oncoming train grew larger, flooding the tunnel with white light, a dark shadow detached itself from the wall of the tunnel. It wasn't a shadow from the train. It was a figure. It was the man. He was sitting on the track bed, leaning against the tunnel wall, obscured by the massive columns. His hood was up, and he was completely still, and I saw the horrifying climax of his ritual. As the train, a massive, deafening machine of collective humanity, thundered toward him, he lifted the large, hooded bundle in his lap. He didn't look at the train. He looked directly at the front of the oncoming engine, his eyes catching the light with a strange, dull intensity. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement that was perfectly timed to the millisecond before the train reached his position, he thrust the object ahead out from under his coat and placed it on the track, right next to the third rail. And then he simply vanished into the dark niche between the tunnel wall and the platform edge. The train hit the object. There was no explosion, no derailment, just a dull, sickening thwack that was immediately swallowed by the colossal roar of the engine. The train slid past, the wind rushing over the platform. I stumbled backward, staring at the flash of lights and the blur of windows. And then, Just as the last car pulled past my position, I saw it. The passenger door on the final car, the very last door, opened fractionally. A small, 4-inch gap, and a small, white, bone-like object rolled out onto the platform. It was almost immediately ground to dust beneath the wheels of the final carriage's bogie. The train stopped. The doors opened. I stood there, utterly paralyzed, staring at the dust. A young man, a calm thinker who looked like a student, stepped off the final car. He was yawning, scrolling on his phone. He looked at me, then down at the ground. He furrowed his brow, looking at the scuff mark in the dust. He took one step forward, then shrugged, and walked up the escalator. I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that whatever the man in the hood was doing, it wasn't a one-off performance for me. The giggling head was a warning, a prop, or a sacrifice. And the man, the limping, dragging figure, was just the messenger, the harbinger of a far more profound, systemic horror. I didn't get on the train. I knew I couldn't. I couldn't ride a machine that had just ground a piece of human life or something that was designed to look like one into the concrete. I stumbled back down the platform, towards the last place I had seen the man disappear. I reached the edge and shined my phone light down. There was nothing there but the oily tracks and the dark, damp tunnel wall. But just as I was about to turn away, the light caught something small, shoved into the grout between the tiles. It was a single sheet of cheap, folded notebook paper. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it. It was a crude crayon drawing, a stick figure, drawn next to a series of vertical lines. Beneath the drawing was a single, neatly printed, chilling message. Rivergate, Monday, 1 a.m., 14. A schedule, a countdown, a tally. I backed away slowly, the terror of the moment overriding my argument with Sarah, my entire life. I had walked into a schedule of terror, and the man with the broken leg was simply a cog in a much larger, horrifying, ritualistic machine that used the anonymity and isolation of the last stop as its sanctuary. The key wasn't the broken man. It was the number, 14. 14 more bodies? 14 more rituals? I threw the note back onto the track, sprinted back up the platform, and found the emergency line phone. I called the transit authority, not the police. "There's something on the track at Rivergate," I gasped. "A disruption. It needs to be looked at." The woman on the other end was a calm thinker, her voice dull with exhaustion. "We're aware of the track anomalies at Rivergate, sir. We've logged the reports." She didn't sound surprised. She sounded bored. I hung up, defeated, realizing the truth. The ritual was known. It was part of the system. It was the unsaid, terrifying price of the subway's operation. I walked the 2 miles to the nearest road where I could find a cab. I never took the subway again, but sometimes, when I'm alone late at night, I pull up the Red Line schedule online, and I check the Rivergate stop. The schedule is always the same, and I wonder, with a cold dread that sits permanently in my chest, what the number is now, and whether the man with the broken leg is still down there, performing his terrible duty, waiting for the next one to see him at the last stop.